Emma's heart stopped as the words left her lips, shattering 3 decades of secrecy. In that moment, she realized her confession would irrevocably alter the lives of 3 families forever. Emma Thompson stood at the kitchen window, watching golden leaves drift lazily to the ground. The crisp November air carried the scent of wood smoke and the promise of the coming winter. She inhaled deeply, savoring the familiar smells of roasting turkey and pumpkin pie that wafted from the oven. Thanksgiving had always been her favorite holiday, a time when her family gathered close and counted their blessings. But this year, a heavy weight settled in her chest, threatening to crush the joy out of the occasion. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its steady ticking a reminder of the moment that was drawing ever closer. In just a few short hours, her entire world would change. The secret she had carried for 35 years would finally be revealed, and there would be no going back. "Mom, do you need any help?" Emma turned to see her son, Michael, standing in the doorway. At 35, he was the spitting image of his father, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile. Her heart clenched at the sight of him, knowing that soon that smile might vanish forever. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she replied, forcing a smile. "Why don't you go help your father set the table?" Michael nodded and disappeared into the dining room. Emma listened to the muffled sounds of plates being arranged and silverware clinking. She closed her eyes, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, the last moment of normalcy before everything fell apart. The doorbell chimed, and Emma's eyes snapped open. She smoothed her apron and plastered on a welcoming smile as she made her way to the front door. When she opened it, she was greeted by the beaming faces of her daughter-in-law, Jessica, and her 2 grandchildren, Ethan and Olivia. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom," Jessica exclaimed, wrapping Emma in a warm hug. The children bounced excitedly, their cheeks rosy from the cold. "Happy Thanksgiving," Emma replied, ushering them inside. Come in. Dinner's almost ready." As the house filled with the chatter of family and the excited squeals of children, Emma felt a momentary sense of peace. This was what she had always wanted: a loving family, a warm home, the joy of traditions passed down through generations. But beneath it all, the truth lurked like a shadow, threatening to swallow everything whole. In the living room, Emma's husband, Robert, was regaling the children with one of his famous stories. His deep, resonant voice carried through the house, punctuated by giggles and gasps from his rapt audience. Emma paused in the doorway, watching the scene with a mixture of love and sorrow. Robert looked up, catching her eye. His smile faltered slightly as he noticed the tension in her posture. "Everything okay, honey?" he asked, his brow furrowing with concern. Emma nodded quickly. "Just checking if you need anything," she said, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. Robert's frown deepened, but before he could press further, Michael called from the dining room. "Dad, can you help me with this centerpiece?" As Robert excused himself, Emma retreated to the safety of the kitchen. She busied herself with last-minute preparations, trying to keep her hands from shaking. The tick of the clock seemed to grow louder with each passing minute, a countdown to the moment that would change everything. A soft knock on the back door startled Emma from her thoughts. She turned to see Sarah Rodriguez, her next-door neighbor, peering through the glass. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Sarah, beautiful, kind-hearted Sarah, who had no idea that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. With trembling hands, Emma opened the door. "Sarah, hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah replied, her dark eyes sparkling. "Mom wanted me to bring this over for your dinner." She held out a covered dish, steam rising from beneath the foil. Emma accepted the dish, careful not to let her fingers brush against Sarah's. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of your mother." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Is everything all right, Mrs. Thompson? You seem upset." Emma forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit overwhelmed with all the cooking. You know how hectic holidays can be." Sarah nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "Well, if you need any help, just let me know. I'm right next door." As Sarah turned to leave, Emma felt the words bubbling up in her throat. She wanted to call out to tell this young woman everything right then and there, but she swallowed hard, forcing the confession back down. It wasn't time yet. The hours ticked by in a blur of activity. Emma moved through the familiar motions of serving dinner, her mind elsewhere as conversation flowed around her. She barely tasted the food, her stomach twisted in knots of anxiety and guilt. Finally, as the plates were cleared and the pumpkin pie was served, Robert stood at the head of the table, raising his glass for the traditional Thanksgiving toast. Emma's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. "Before we begin," Robert said, his voice warm with emotion, "I'd like to say how grateful I am to have all of you. Family is the most precious gift we have, and I'm thankful every day for each and every one of you." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Emma felt tears pricking at her eyes as she looked at the faces of her loved ones. Robert, Michael, Jessica, the grandchildren, and even Sarah, who had joined them for dessert at Michael's insistence. This is it, Emma thought. It's now or never. As Robert opened his mouth to continue, Emma stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. All eyes turned to her, expressions of surprise and concern flickering across their faces. "I have something to say," Emma began, her voice quavering. She gripped the edge of the table for support, feeling as though she might collapse at any moment. "Something I should have told you all a long time ago." Robert reached for her hand, his brow furrowed with worry. "Emma, what is it? What's wrong?" Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for the words that would shatter their world. 35 years ago, when I was working as a nurse in the maternity ward, I made a terrible mistake." Her eyes flickered between Michael and Sarah, both watching her with growing unease. "I accidentally switched two babies." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears as she watched the shock and disbelief spread across the faces of her loved ones. Michael was the first to break the silence. "What are you saying, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her son, the child she had raised and loved for 35 years. "I'm saying, you might not be our biological son, Michael." And Sarah, she turned to the young woman who had gone pale with shock. "You might be." The room erupted into chaos. Questions flew from all directions, voices rising in confusion and anger. Emma stood in the center of it all, feeling as though she were watching the scene unfold from somewhere far away. Robert's voice cut through the tumult, sharp with disbelief and betrayal. "Emma, how could you keep this from us? How could you lie for all these years?" Emma's legs gave out, and she sank back into her chair. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I'm so sorry. I was young and scared. I convinced myself it was better not to say anything, that it would only hurt everyone if the truth came out." Michael stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward. His face was a mask of pain and confusion. "So everything, my whole life, it's all been a lie?" "No, sweetheart, no," Emma pleaded, reaching for him. But Michael recoiled from her touch, backing away as if she were a stranger. Sarah sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling, "are you saying that the Rodriguez family, they're not?" Emma nodded, unable to form the words. She watched as the realization dawned on Sarah's face, saw the moment when her world tilted on its axis. Jessica, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "How can you be sure? After all this time, how can you know for certain?" Emma closed her eyes, the memory washing over her with painful clarity. It was a busy night in the maternity ward. There were 3 babies born within minutes of each other, 2 boys and a girl. In the chaos, I mixed up the name tags. She opened her eyes, looking between Michael and Sarah. "I realized my mistake almost immediately, but by then, you had already been taken to your parents." I panicked. I convinced myself that since 2 of the babies were boys, there was a chance I had put them back correctly. The room fell silent once more as the implications of Emma's words sank in. Not only had she potentially switched Michael and Sarah, but there was a 3rd family out there, unknowingly raising a child that might not be theirs. Robert's voice was cold when he finally spoke. "All these years, Emma, all these years, you've carried this secret. How could you look us in the eye every day, knowing what you've done?" Emma's shoulders slumped under the weight of her guilt. "I told myself it was better this way, that everyone was happy, and revealing the truth would only cause pain. But the guilt, it's eaten away at me every single day. Michael, who had been staring out the window, turned back to face the room. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice hoarse with emotion. So what now? We just… what? Take a DNA test and find out if our entire lives have been a lie? Emma nodded weakly. It's the only way to know for sure. I'm so sorry, Michael. I never meant to hurt you, any of you. Sarah stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need to go, she said, her voice barely audible. I need to talk to my parents. As Sarah fled the room, Emma felt a piece of her heart break. She wanted to call out, to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But she knew it was too late. The damage was done. The once joyful Thanksgiving dinner had devolved into a scene of shock and devastation. As Emma looked around at the shattered remains of her family's trust, she realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and painful, filled with questions, recriminations, and the agonizing search for truth. But as she met Robert's eyes across the table, eyes filled with hurt and betrayal, but also a flicker of the love they had shared for decades, Emma knew that she had made the right choice in finally revealing her secret. The truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward healing. As the gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy fog, Emma braced herself for the difficult journey ahead. The family she had built and cherished for 35 years now stood on shaky ground, its very foundation called into question. But amidst the pain and confusion, a small spark of hope flickered in Emma's chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, the truth could set them all free. As the initial shock of Emma's revelation began to ebb, the Thompson family found themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The once warm dining room now felt cold and alien, the remnants of their Thanksgiving feast a stark reminder of how quickly their world had changed. Michael paced the length of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The rhythmic sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floor punctuated the heavy silence. Emma watched him, her heart aching with every turn he made. She longed to reach out, to comfort him as she had done countless times throughout his life. But the invisible barrier between them seemed insurmountable. Robert sat at the head of the table, his head in his hands. The weight of betrayal hung heavy on his shoulders. Decades of trust and love now called into question. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a mix of anger and confusion. I don't understand, Emma, he said, his voice hoarse. How could you keep this from me? From us? We've shared everything for over 40 years. Emma's hands trembled as she clasped them in her lap. I was so young, Robert, so scared. By the time I realized the full implications of what I'd done, it felt too late to come forward. I told myself that if I just kept quiet, everyone would be happy. Happy? Michael's voice cut through the room like a whip. He spun to face his mother, eyes blazing. You thought we'd be happy living a lie? Did you ever stop to think about how this would affect us when the truth finally came out? Emma flinched at the anger in her son's voice. I'm so sorry, Michael. I know sorry isn't enough, but I don't know what else to say. I love you. You're my son, no matter what a DNA test might say. Michael's face crumpled, the anger giving way to raw pain. But that's just it, isn't it? I might not be your son. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, my identity, it's all up in the air now. Jessica, who had been quietly comforting the children in the next room, returned to stand beside her husband. She placed a gentle hand on Michael's arm, her touch seeming to ground him slightly. We don't know anything for certain yet, Jessica said, her voice calm and measured. Before we jump to conclusions, we need to get all the facts. Mrs. Thompson. She turned to Emma, her expression a mix of sympathy and determination. You said there were 3 babies involved that night. Do you remember anything about the third family? Emma closed her eyes, trying to recall details from that chaotic night 35 years ago. It's all a bit of a blur, she admitted. But I remember the other boy's last name was Chun. The parents were first-generation immigrants, I think. They were so excited to have their first child born in America. Robert's head snapped up. Chun? As in David Chun? The lawyer? Emma's eyes widened. Yes, that sounds right. David Chun. He would be the same age as Michael and Sarah. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. David Chun was a prominent figure in their community, a successful attorney known for his pro bono work and community involvement. The idea that he too might be caught up in this web of mistaken identity added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Michael ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. So not only might I not be a Thompson, but I could be a Rodriguez or a Chun. This is insane. We need to approach this methodically, Robert said, his logical mind seeming to kick in despite the emotional turmoil. First things first, we need DNA tests. Emma, you'll need to provide a sample as well to confirm maternity for both Michael and Sarah. Emma nodded, relief washing over her at the prospect of concrete action. Of course, whatever it takes to sort this out. And what about the Chens? Jessica asked. And the Rodriguez family? They have a right to know what's going on. The mention of the Rodriguez family sent a fresh wave of guilt through Emma. Sarah had left in such a state of shock, and Emma couldn't help but worry about her. I should go check on Sarah, she said, starting to rise from her chair. No, Michael said firmly. I'll go. She's my friend. And right now, I think seeing you might do more harm than good. Emma sank back into her seat, nodding sadly. She watched as Michael grabbed his coat and headed for the door, Jessica following close behind. As the door closed behind them, Emma felt as though a piece of her heart had walked out with. Robert's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Emma, I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. No more secrets, no more half-truths. I need to understand how we got here. Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for the difficult conversation ahead. She began to speak, her voice soft but steady as she recounted the events of that fateful night 35 years ago. As Emma spoke, the scene shifted to the Rodriguez household next door. Sarah burst through the front door, her mind reeling from the bombshell Emma had dropped. Her parents, Elena and Carlos, looked up from their after-dinner coffee, startled by their daughter's abrupt entrance. Mia, what's wrong? Elena asked, rising from her seat with concern etched on her face. Sarah stood in the entryway, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to find the words. How could she possibly explain what she had just learned? How could she shatter her parents' world the way hers had been shattered? Sarah? Carlos's deep voice was tinged with worry as he approached his daughter. Did something happen at the Thompsons? The sound of her father's voice, the man who had raised her, loved her, taught her everything she knew, broke something inside Sarah. Tears began to stream down her face as she choked out. Mom, Dad, I don't know how to say this, but Mrs. Thompson just told us something that changes everything. Elena and Carlos exchanged worried glances before guiding Sarah to the couch. As they sat on either side of her, Sarah found herself enveloped in the familiar, comforting scent of her mother's perfume and her father's aftershave. The thought that these comforting presences might not truly be her parents sent a fresh wave of pain through her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah began to recount Emma's confession. She watched as confusion, then disbelief, and finally shock spread across her parents' faces. When she finished, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations of Rodriguez men. Carlos was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. This can't be right. There must be some mistake. You are our daughter, Sarah. We were there when you were born. Elena nodded vigorously, tears glistening in her eyes. I remember every moment of that day. The pain, the joy, the first time I held you in my arms. How could there be any doubt? Sarah's heart clenched at the pain in her parents' voices. I don't know, she said softly. Mrs. Thompson said she mixed up the name tags, that there were 3 babies born around the same time. She's not even sure if I'm the one who was switched. A knock at the door startled them all. Carlos rose to answer it, revealing Michael and Jessica standing on the porch. The tension in the air was palpable as Carlos wordlessly stepped aside to let them in. As Michael entered the living room, his eyes locked with Sarah's. In that moment, a lifetime of shared memories flashed between them. Growing up next door to each other, first day of school pictures taken together, high school graduations, countless family barbecues, and holiday celebrations. The idea that they might actually be siblings seemed at once impossible and strangely fitting. "I'm sorry to intrude," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I thought we should talk, all of us." Elena nodded, her arm tightening around Sarah's shoulders. "Yes, I think that's a good idea. Please, sit down." As Michael and Jessica took seats across from the Rodriguez family, the reality of the situation seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. These two families, who had lived side by side for decades, sharing joys and sorrows, were now faced with a truth that could redefine everything they thought they knew. "So," Carlos said, breaking the uncomfortable silence, "what do we do now?" Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Dad, Mr. Thompson thinks we should start with DNA tests to know for sure." Sarah nodded slowly. "That makes sense. But what about the other family? The Chens? Don't they have a right to know what's going on?" "One step at a time," Jessica interjected, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil surrounding her. "First, we confirm if there's any truth to this. Then we can decide how to proceed with involving the Chens or anyone else." As the two families began to discuss the logistics of DNA testing and the potential ramifications of the results, a sense of unreality hung in the air. This was a conversation none of them ever imagined having. Yet here they were, planning to unravel the very fabric of their identities. Outside, the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful end to a day that had started with such promise and ended in chaos. As night fell, two households grappled with a truth that threatened to reshape their understanding of family, identity, and the bonds that tie us together. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with emotional landmines. But as Michael and Sarah exchanged a look of shared determination, there was also a glimmer of hope. Whatever the truth might be, they would face it together, as family, in whatever form that might take. As the night deepened, the initial shock of Emma's revelation began to give way to a flurry of activity. The Thompson and Rodriguez families, once separated by a mere property line, now found themselves inextricably linked by a shared uncertainty that demanded answers. In the Thompson household, Robert had taken charge, his legal background kicking into high gear as he navigated the complexities of their situation. He sat at the dining room table, laptop open, furiously researching DNA testing facilities and the legal implications of their predicament. Emma hovered nearby, a ghost in her own home, watching as her husband of 4 decades threw himself into solving a problem she had created. The weight of her secret, carried for so long, seemed to press down on her, making each breath a struggle. "Robert," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not now, Emma." Robert cut her off, his eyes never leaving the screen. "I need to focus on finding us a way forward. We can deal with everything else later." Emma nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. She understood his reaction, knew she deserved his anger and distance, but it didn't make it hurt any less. Silently, she retreated to the kitchen, busying herself with cleaning up the remnants of their interrupted Thanksgiving dinner. As she mechanically loaded dishes into the dishwasher, Emma's mind wandered to happier times. She thought of the day Michael was born, the overwhelming love she felt when she first held him in her arms. She remembered his first steps, his first words, the proud smile on his face when he graduated college. A lifetime of memories, all now tainted by the knowledge of her deception. A soft knock at the back door pulled Emma from her reverie. She looked up to see Elena Rodriguez standing on the other side of the glass, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. With trembling hands, Emma opened the door. "Elena," she said, her voice catching. "I'm so sorry." "I never meant—" Elena held up a hand, silencing Emma's apology. "I didn't come for apologies, Emma. I came because I need to understand. How could you do this? How could you keep this secret for so long?" Emma stepped back, gesturing for Elena to enter. As the two women settled at the kitchen table, the weight of 35 years of friendship and hidden truths hung heavy between them. Taking a deep breath, Emma began to speak. "It was my first year as a nurse. I was young, overwhelmed, and terrified of making a mistake. That night, it was chaos in the maternity ward. 3 babies born within minutes of each other, all of them crying, and I mixed up the name tags. Elena listened intently, her dark eyes never leaving Emma's face. But why didn't you say something when you realized what had happened? Emma's hands twisted in her lap. By the time I figured it out, you had already taken Sarah home. You were so happy, Elena. I saw the love in your eyes when you looked at her, and I convinced myself that it would be cruel to take that away from you. And then days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and suddenly years had passed, and I couldn't find the courage to speak up. Silence fell between them as Elena processed Emma's words. Outside, the wind rustled through the bare branches of the old oak tree that had stood sentinel between their properties for decades. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice thick with emotion. I remember the day we brought Sarah home. Carlos and I had tried for so long to have a baby, and when we finally held her, it felt like a miracle. She was perfect, Emma. She is perfect. And now you're telling me she might not be ours? Emma reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand over Elena's. Sarah is your daughter, Elena, in every way that matters. No DNA changed the love you've given her, the life you've built together. Elena's eyes filled with tears. But what if she is yours? What if Michael is ours? How do we move forward from this? Before Emma could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Moments later, Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face etched with exhaustion and turmoil. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I think we need to talk." As Michael joined the women at the table, the atmosphere in the room shifted. This was no longer just about Emma's confession or the shock of revelation. This was about 3 lives irrevocably changed. 3 people caught in a web of uncertainty and conflicting emotions. Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar to Emma that it made her heart ache. "I've been thinking," he began, his words slow and measured, "about identity, about what makes us who we are. Is it our DNA, our upbringing, the choices we make?" Emma and Elena exchanged a glance, both sensing the weight of Michael's words. "I don't have any answers," Michael continued, "but I know that regardless of what any DNA test might say, you're my mom, Emma. You raised me, loved me, shaped me into the person I am today. And Mrs. Rodriguez, Elena, you and Carlos have been like second parents to me my whole life. The idea that you might actually be my biological parents, it's overwhelming, but it doesn't change how I feel about either of you." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she listened to her son, for he would always be her son, no matter what, grapple with the impossible situation they found themselves in. Elena reached out, taking one of Michael's hands in hers and one of Emma's in the other. "Michael, mijo, you're right. Love is what makes a family. But we also can't ignore the truth, however painful it might be. We owe it to ourselves, to Sarah, and yes, even to the Chun family, to find out what really happened that night." Michael nodded, squeezing Elena's hand. "You're right. We need answers. But whatever those answers might be, we face them together, all of us." As the 3 of them sat there, hands linked, a sense of unity began to form. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with emotional landmines and potential heartbreak. But in that moment, there was also a glimmer of hope, a hope born from the unbreakable bonds of love and shared history that connected them all. Across the street, in the Rodriguez household, Sarah sat on the edge of her childhood bed, surrounded by the trappings of a life she had always believed was hers without question. Photos lined the walls. Sarah's first day of school, family vacations, her quinceañera. Each image now seemed to taunt her with its potential falsehood. A soft knock on the door pulled Sarah from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos entered, his normally confident stride hesitant as he approached his daughter. He sat beside her on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "Mia," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I want you to know, no matter what any test might say, you are my daughter, your mother, and I We've loved you from the moment we first saw you. That will never change." Sarah leaned into her father's embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Papa. I love you and Mom so much. It's just, I'm scared. What if I'm not who I thought I was? What if everything I believed about myself is a lie?" Carlos pulled back slightly, cupping Sarah's face in his hands. "Listen to me, Sarah Elena Rodriguez. You are not a lie. You are smart, kind, stubborn as a mule sometimes." This earned a watery chuckle from Sarah. "And you are loved. Your name, your DNA, these things don't define you. It's your heart, your actions, your love for others that make you who you are." As Sarah nodded, drinking in her father's words, a commotion from downstairs caught their attention. They descended the stairs to find Jessica in the living room, her face flushed with excitement and trepidation. "I'm sorry to barge in," Jessica said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "But I think I've found something. I've been doing some research, and there's a DNA testing facility in the city that specializes in complex family situations. They can have results back in as little as 48 hours. Carlos and Sarah exchanged a look. This was it. The moment when hypotheticals would become reality, when the truth they'd been grappling with would be confirmed or denied with scientific certainty. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Let's do it. Let's find out the truth." As the Rodriguez family prepared to embark on this next step of their journey, a sense of anticipation mixed with dread settled over them. In less than 2 days, their world could be turned upside down once again. Back at the Thompson house, Robert emerged from his impromptu office, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with purpose. "I've made some calls," he announced to Emma, Michael, and Elena. "I've arranged for DNA testing first thing in the morning. I've also reached out to a colleague who specializes in medical malpractice. We need to be prepared for all possibilities." Emma flinched at the mention of medical malpractice, the full legal ramifications of her actions hitting her anew. But she straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever consequences might come. "What about the Chens?" Michael asked. "Do we tell them before or after we get the results?" Robert sighed, running a hand over his face. I think we need to tell them now. They deserve to know what's going on, to have the chance to be tested along with us. It's the right thing to do." As the gravity of the situation settled over the room once more, a new resolve began to take shape. Whatever the truth might be, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, not as two separate families, but as one united front. The clock on the wall chimed midnight, marking the end of a Thanksgiving day unlike any other. As a new day dawned, bringing with it the promise of answers and the potential for heartbreak, the Thompson and Rodriguez families stood on the precipice of a truth that would redefine their understanding of family, identity, and the unbreakable bonds of love. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street, the Thompson and Rodriguez households stirred to life. The night had been long and restless, filled with churning thoughts and unanswered questions. Now, with the promise of answers on the horizon, a nervous energy permeated both homes. In the Thompson kitchen, Emma moved mechanically through the motions of brewing coffee, her mind elsewhere. The familiar routine felt oddly comforting amidst the chaos of their new reality. As the rich aroma of coffee filled the air, Robert entered, looking as if he hadn't slept at all. "I spoke with David Chen last night," he said without preamble, accepting the mug Emma offered him. "He and his wife will meet us at the testing facility this morning." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she poured her own coffee. How did he take the news? Robert's expression was grim, about as well as can be expected. Shock, disbelief, anger. But he agreed that we need to know the truth for everyone's sake. A soft knock at the back door interrupted their conversation. Michael stood there, Jessica by his side, both looking pale and drawn. As Emma ushered them in, she noticed Sarah hovering uncertainly on the back porch. "Sarah, honey, please come in," Emma said, her heart aching at the young woman's hesitation. As they all gathered around the kitchen table, the weight of the day ahead hung heavy in the air. Emma couldn't help but notice how Michael and Sarah unconsciously mirrored each other's posture, both hunched slightly as if bracing against an unseen force. The possibility that they might truly be siblings suddenly seemed more real than ever. So, Michael broke the silence, his voice rough with lack of sleep. What's the plan? Robert took charge, outlining the day's schedule with lawyerly precision. The appointment at the testing facility is at 9 a.m. David and Lisa Chun will meet us there. We'll all provide DNA samples, and they've agreed to rush the results. We should know. We should have answers within 48 hours. Sarah spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. And then what? What happens when we get the results? The question hung in the air, unanswered. None of them knew quite how to articulate the myriad of possibilities and complications that lay ahead. Jessica, ever practical, stepped into the breach. One step at a time, she said firmly. Right now, let's focus on getting through today. Everything else, we'll deal with it when we have to. As the group prepared to leave for the testing facility, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen for a moment. She braced herself against the counter, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was about to unfold. A lifetime of secrecy and guilt was about to come to an end, for better or worse. Emma? Elena's voice startled her. She turned to find her friend. Was that still the right word? Standing in the doorway. Carlos and I are here. Are you ready? Emma nodded, straightening her shoulders. As ready as I'll ever be, she replied, managing a weak smile. The drive to the testing facility was tense, the two families caravanning in separate cars. As they pulled into the parking lot, Emma spotted a couple standing near the entrance, their body language radiating discomfort and uncertainty. The Chens had arrived. As the group converged at the entrance, an awkward silence fell. David Chun, a man Emma had known peripherally for years as a respected member of the community, now looked at her with a mixture of confusion and barely concealed anger. Mrs. Thompson, he said stiffly, I hope you understand the gravity of what you're suggesting. If what you say is true, David, Robert interjected, his tone conciliatory, I know this is a lot to process. We're all in shock, but right now, the most important thing is to get the facts. Once we have the results, we can figure out how to move forward. Lisa Chun, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I just don't understand how this could have happened. We were there when our son was born. We held him, we named him. How could there be any doubt? Emma felt the weight of all eyes upon her. This was the moment she had dreaded for 35 years. The moment when she would have to face the full consequences of her actions. I'm so sorry, she began, her voice wavering. I was young, inexperienced. There were 3 babies born within minutes of each other that night. In the chaos, I mixed up the name tags. By the time I realized my mistake, you had all taken your babies home. I convinced myself that since 2 of the babies were boys, there was a chance I had put them back correctly. I told myself that saying anything would only cause pain, but the guilt, it's eaten away at me every day since. As Emma's words hung in the air, a mix of emotions played across the faces of those gathered. Anger, disbelief, sympathy, fear, all swirled together in a potent cocktail of human reaction. Before anyone could respond, the door to the facility opened and a lab technician stepped out. Thompson, Rodriguez, and Chun families? She called. We're ready for you now. As they filed into the sterile environment of the testing facility, the reality of what they were about to do settled over the group. This wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a moment that would redefine their understanding of family, identity, and the very fabric of their lives. The process itself was surprisingly quick and anticlimactic. Cheek swabs were taken, forms were filled out, and within an hour, it was done. As they emerged back into the bright morning sunlight, there was a sense of suspended animation, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. So now we wait, Michael said, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, unconsciously moving closer to him. 2 days. It feels like forever and no time at all. As the group prepared to go their separate ways, David Chun cleared his throat. I think we should all meet when the results come in. Whatever they say, we're in this together now. There were nods of agreement all around. As painful and shocking as this situation was, there was a growing sense of unity among the three families. They were bound together now by circumstance and shared uncertainty. As Emma watched the Chens drive away, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Robert looking at her, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "Let's go home," he said softly. "We have a lot to talk about." The ride home was silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Emma found herself stealing glances at Michael in the rearview mirror, drinking in every familiar feature of his face. Was this the last time she would look at him as her son? Or would the test confirm what her heart already knew, that regardless of biology, Michael was and always would be her child? As they pulled into the driveway, Emma noticed Sarah standing on the Rodriguez's front porch, watching their arrival. On impulse, Emma got out of the car and walked over to her. "Sarah," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I just want you to know, no matter what the test results say, you will always have a place in our family. We've loved you since the day you were born, even if we didn't know." Even if Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, unable to speak. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped forward and hugged Emma tightly. It was a gesture of forgiveness, of understanding, of love that transcended the boundaries of biology. As Emma returned to her own house, she found Robert waiting for her in the living room. The look on his face told her that the time for avoidance was over. They needed to talk, really talk, about everything that had happened and what it meant for their future. "Sit down, Emma," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm. "I think it's time you told me everything, from the beginning. No more secrets, no more half-truths. If we're going to get through this, I need to understand." Emma nodded, sinking into the armchair across from her husband. As she began to speak, unraveling the threads of a secret kept for 35 years, she felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. Whatever the future held, whatever the test results might reveal, the truth was finally, irrevocably, out in the open. And in that moment of brutal honesty, a small seed of hope began to take root. Perhaps, just perhaps, the truth really could set them free. As Emma's confession unfolded, the living room became a confessional of sorts, the fading afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. Robert listened intently, his face a canvas of shifting emotions, pain, anger, confusion, and, occasionally, a flicker of understanding. Emma spoke of that chaotic night in the maternity ward, the overwhelming fear of a young nurse faced with her first major mistake. She described the paralyzing indecision in the days that followed, the rationalization that silence was kinder than truth. As the years passed, the weight of her secret grew, becoming an invisible barrier between her and those she loved most. "I wanted to tell you so many times, Robert," Emma said, her voice hoarse from talking. "Every birthday, every milestone, I'd look at Michael and think, what if he's not ours? But then I'd see how much he looks like you, how he has your laugh, your stubborn streak. I convinced myself that it was better not to know, that ignorance was bliss." Robert leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But Emma, didn't you think about the other families? The Rodriguezes, the Chens? Didn't they deserve to know the truth?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Of course I did. It tore me apart, watching Sarah grow up next door, seeing how much she looked like Elena. And every time I saw David Chun in town, I'd wonder. But by then, it felt like it was too late. How could I upend everyone's lives after so many years?" As Emma's words trailed off, a heavy silence fell over the room. Robert stood, pacing the length of the living room, his lawyer's mind grappling with the implications of his wife's confession. "You know," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "there could be serious legal consequences for this. Malpractice, emotional distress, if the families decide to press charges." Emma nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I know, and I'll face whatever consequences come. I hope that someday you can forgive me, Robert, that Michael can forgive me." Robert stopped his pacing, turning to face his wife of 4 decades, the woman he had built a life with, raised a child with, shared countless joys and sorrows with. In that moment, he saw not just the weight of her secret, but the toll it had taken on her over the years. "Emma," he said softly, crossing the room to kneel in front of her chair, "I won't pretend this doesn't hurt. It does. but we've been through too much together for this to break us. Whatever happens, whatever the test results say, we'll face it together." As Emma collapsed into her husband's embrace, sobbing with relief and residual guilt, a knock at the front door startled them both. Michael stood in the doorway, his face etched with a mix of determination and fear. "Mom, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I think we need to talk about what happens next." All of us. Within the hour, the Thompson living room had become the epicenter of an impromptu family summit. The Rodriguezes and the Chens joined them, an uneasy alliance bound by shared uncertainty and the need for answers. As they all settled into seats, the atmosphere was thick with tension and unasked questions. Sarah and Michael sat side by side on the couch, their shoulders touching, a united front in the face of the unknown. Elena and Carlos Rodriguez occupied the love seat, their hands clasped tightly together. David and Lisa Chung perched uncomfortably on chairs brought in from the dining room, still looking somewhat shell-shocked by the situation they found themselves in. Robert, ever the mediator, took charge of the impromptu meeting. "I know we're all feeling overwhelmed right now," he began, his calm demeanor a balm to the frayed nerves in the room. "But I think it's important that we discuss how we want to handle things when the test results come in." David Chung leaned forward, his lawyer's instincts kicking in. "What are our options legally speaking? If the tests confirm, if our children were indeed switched, what recourse do we have?" Emma flinched at the question, but Robert placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Legally, there are several avenues we could pursue," he said carefully. "Malpractice suits against the hospital, emotional distress claims, but I think before we go down that road, we need to consider the human cost of such actions." Carlos Rodriguez, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, the human cost has already been paid. For 35 years, we've lived a lie. Our children have lived a lie. How do we even begin to process that?" The room fell silent as the weight of Carlos's words settled over them. It was Sarah who finally broke the tension, her voice soft but determined. "I understand the anger, the hurt," she said, looking around the room at the people who had shaped her life in one way or another. "But I think we need to remember that no matter what the test results say, the love we've shared, the memories we've made, they're real. They matter." Michael nodded, picking up where Sarah left off. "Sarah's right. Mom, Dad," he said, looking at Emma and Robert. "You raised me. You've been there for every skin knee, every triumph, every heartbreak. That doesn't change because of a DNA test." He turned to the Rodriguezes. "And you've been like a second family to me my whole life. If it turns out that you're my biological parents, well, that just means I've been doubly blessed." Lisa Chung, who had been quietly observing until now, spoke up. "But what about our son? What if he's not ours? How do we even begin to tell him?" The question hung in the air, a stark reminder of the far-reaching consequences of Emma's long-ago mistake. It wasn't just about the people in this room. There was another life, another family, potentially affected by this revelation. Emma, who had been silent throughout the discussion, finally found her voice. "I know I have no right to ask anything of any of you," she said, her words halting but sincere. "But I hope that whatever the results show, we can find a way forward that doesn't destroy the relationships we've built. That we can find a way to expand our understanding of family rather than fracture what we have." As Emma's words sank in, a thoughtful silence fell over the room. The anger and shock that had dominated the earlier conversations began to give way to a more nuanced understanding of the complex situation they all found themselves in. David Chung, his expression softening slightly, was the first to respond. "I can't pretend I'm not angry," he said, his voice measured. "But I also can't ignore the fact that for 35 years, I've loved my son with every fiber of my being. That love, it's real, regardless of biology." Elena Rodriguez nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Say, it's the same for us. Sarah, Mihija, you are our daughter in every way that matters. Nothing can change that." As the conversation continued, a tentative plan began to take shape. They would wait for the test results together, as a united group. Whatever the outcome, They would approach it with open minds and open hearts, prioritizing the well-being of their children, all of their children, above all else. As the impromptu meeting drew to a close, there was a palpable shift in the room's energy. The anger and fear hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been tempered by a growing sense of unity and shared purpose. Michael and Sarah, who'd been quiet for much of the discussion, exchanged a look of understanding. Whatever the test results might reveal, they had formed a bond that transcended traditional definitions of family. As the Chens and Rodriguezes prepared to leave, Emma found herself face to face with Elena. The two women, friends for decades, now stood on the precipice of a new and uncharted relationship. "Elena," Emma began, her voice thick with emotion. But Elena cut her off, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We have a long road ahead, amiga," she whispered, "but we'll walk it together." As the front door closed behind the last of their guests, Emma turned to find Robert and Michael watching her. The love and concern in their eyes nearly broke her. "Well," Robert said, attempting a smile, "I guess all we can do now is wait." Michael nodded, crossing the room to wrap his arms around both his parents. "Whatever happens," he said firmly, "we're still a family. Nothing can change that." As they stood there, locked in a family embrace, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. The next 24 hours would bring answers that could reshape their world. But in this moment, surrounded by the unconditional love of her family, she knew they would find a way through. The sun had long since set, casting the Thompson living room in soft shadows. As they began to prepare for a night that promised little sleep, the air was charged with anticipation. Tomorrow would bring answers, but it would also bring new questions, new challenges. Yet as Emma looked at her husband and son, she felt a strength she hadn't known in years. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family, in all its complex, beautiful, unexpected forms. As the night settled over the neighborhood, an uneasy quiet descended upon the Thompson and Rodriguez households. The Chens had returned to their home across town, each family retreating to process the day's events and brace for the revelations to come. In the Thompson house, sleep proved elusive. Emma tossed and turned, her mind racing with memories and what-ifs. Beside her, Robert lay still, his breathing measured, but she knew he was just as awake as she was. Down the hall, Michael sat at his old desk, the soft glow of his laptop illuminating his face. He found himself scrolling through old family photos, studying every image with new intensity. Did he really have his father's eyes? Was that smile truly his mother's? Every familiar feature now seemed like a puzzle piece that might not fit. Next door, the Rodriguez family was experiencing a similar night of reflection and insomnia. Sarah sat cross-legged on her childhood bed, surrounded by photo albums and keepsakes. Each memento now carried the weight of potential falsehood, yet she couldn't bring herself to put them away. In the early hours of the morning, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Can't sleep. Meet me at the old treehouse?" Without hesitation, Sarah replied, "On my way." The old treehouse stood at the border between the Thompson and Rodriguez properties, a relic of Michael and Sarah's shared childhood. As Sarah approached, she saw Michael's silhouette already perched on the platform, his legs dangling over the edge. "Hey," she said softly, climbing up to join him. "Hey," Michael replied, scooting over to make room. "Thanks for coming." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, gazing out at the familiar landscape of their neighborhood, now bathed in the ethereal light of the pre-dawn hours. "It's weird," Michael finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything looks the same, but it all feels different." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "I keep looking at old photos, trying to see if I can spot some sign, some clue that I'm not really a Rodriguez. But then I think, does it even matter?" Michael turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "That's just it, isn't it? Does biology trump everything else? The love, the memories, the shared experiences. Do those mean less if we're not genetically related to the people who raised us?" "I don't think so," Sarah said firmly. "I mean, look at adopted families or step-families. Blood doesn't define family, love does." Michael nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, if the tests show that we're actually siblings, It would explain a lot. Like why we've always been able to finish each other's sentences. Sarah finished, grinning despite the gravity of their situation. They lapsed into silence again, each lost in their own thoughts. The sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn painting the horizon in soft pinks and golds. "Whatever happens," Michael said, breaking the silence. "Whatever the results say, you'll always be family to me, Sarah. Sister, friend, neighbor. The label doesn't matter. You're important to me, and that won't change." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes as she reached out to squeeze Michael's hand. "Same here," she said softly. "We're in this together, no matter what." As the sun crept higher in the sky, Michael and Sarah made their way back to their respective homes, both feeling a bit lighter despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. Inside the Thompson house, Emma was already in the kitchen, the scent of coffee filling the air. She looked up as Michael entered, her eyes searching his face anxiously. "Morning, Mom," Michael said, crossing the room to plant a kiss on her cheek. "You're up early." Emma managed a wan smile. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "How about you? You look like you've been up for a while." Michael shrugged, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Met Sarah at the treehouse. We talked for a bit." Emma's hand stilled on the mug she was holding. "Oh? How is she doing?" "About as well as can be expected," Michael replied. "We're all just trying to process, I guess." Emma nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Michael, But before she could continue, Robert entered the kitchen, his presence bringing a sudden halt to the conversation. The tension in the room was palpable as he moved to pour his own coffee. "The testing facility called," Robert said, his voice carefully neutral. "The results are ready. They said we can come in at 2 p.m. Emma and Michael exchanged a look, the reality of what was to come hitting them anew. This was it. In just a few hours, they would have answers that could potentially reshape their entire understanding of family and identity. "I'll call the Rodriguezes and the Chens," Robert continued. "We should all be there together when we find out." As Robert stepped out to make the calls, Emma found herself face to face with her son. The son she had raised, loved, and cherished for 35 years. The son who, in a matter of hours, might be revealed to not be hers at all. "Michael," she began, her voice cracking with emotion. "No matter what those results say, you are my son. I love you, and that will never change." Michael pulled his mother into a tight embrace, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, Mom. I love you too. We'll get through this, whatever happens." The hours leading up to the appointment passed in a blur of nervous energy and attempted normalcy. Emma busied herself with household chores, while Robert retreated to his home office, buried in legal documents. Michael found himself pacing the house, unable to settle, his mind racing with possibilities. At 1:30 p.m., the Thompsons piled into their car, the short drive to the testing facility feeling both interminable and all too quick. As they pulled into the parking lot, they saw the Rodriguez family already waiting, with the Chens pulling in right behind them. The 6 adults and 2 children, who might or might not be their biological offspring, stood in a loose circle, the tension palpable. It was David Chun who finally broke the silence. "Well," he said, his lawyer's composure barely masking his anxiety, "shall we?" As they filed into the sterile waiting room, Emma felt as though she were moving through a dream. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp. This ordinary medical facility was about to become the stage for a revelation that would change all their lives forever. A nurse appeared, clipboard in hand. "Thompson, Rodriguez, and Chun families?" she called, her tone professionally neutral. Robert stepped forward. "That's us," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. The nurse nodded, gesturing for them to follow her. "Dr. Patel will see you now." As they were led down a long hallway, Emma felt Robert's hand slip into hers, a silent gesture of support. On her other side, Michael walked close, his shoulder brushing against hers with each step. Despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, Emma felt a surge of love for her family, whatever form that family might take after today. The nurse ushered them into a large conference room where a middle-aged woman in a white coat waited, a folder on the table in front of her. Dr. Patel's kind face was etched with the gravity of the information. she was about to impart. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the table. As everyone settled in, an expectant hush fell over the room. Emma found herself holding her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Dr. Patel looked around the room, making eye contact with each person before she spoke. "I understand this is an incredibly difficult and emotional situation for all of you," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "I want you to know that whatever these results show, it doesn't negate the love and bonds you've formed over the years. Family is about more than just DNA." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. "That being said, I know you're all anxious to hear the results. So, without further ado, Dr. Patel opened the folder, and Emma felt the world narrow to this single moment. Whatever came next would irreversibly change the course of all their lives. Based on the DNA samples provided, Dr. Patel began, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "We can confirm that." Emma closed her eyes, bracing for the truth that was about to be revealed. In this suspended moment, balanced on the knife edge between knowing and not knowing, she sent up a silent prayer, not for any specific outcome, but for the strength to face whatever came next. As Dr. Patel's words filled the room, Emma felt Robert's hand tighten around hers. On her other side, she heard Michael's sharp intake of breath. The truth, so long hidden, was finally coming to light. And with it, a new chapter in all their lives was about to begin. Dr. Patel's voice cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. "Based on the DNA samples provided, we can confirm that there was indeed a mix-up at the hospital 35 years ago." A collective gasp filled the room, followed by a heavy silence. Emma felt her world tilt on its axis, the confirmation of her worst fears hitting her like a physical blow. Dr. Patel continued, her tone gentle but matter-of-fact. "Michael Thompson is the biological son of Elena and Carlos Rodriguez. Sarah Rodriguez is the biological daughter of Emma and Robert Thompson. And David Chen Jr. is the biological son of Lisa and David Chen Sar." The room erupted into a cacophony of reactions. Elena Rodriguez let out a strangled sob, burying her face in her husband's shoulder. David Chen Sar stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Sarah and Michael exchanged a wide-eyed look of shock and recognition. Emma felt Robert's hand tighten around hers, anchoring her to the moment. She turned to look at Michael, her son, but not her son, and found him staring back at her, his expression a mix of confusion and pain. "I don't understand," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can this be?" Dr. Patel's voice cut through the chaos. "I know this is a lot to process. I have detailed reports for each family, explaining the genetic markers that led to these conclusions. But I want to stress again, biology is only one part of what makes a family. The bonds you formed over the past 35 years are real and valid." David Chen Sar, who had been pacing at the edge of the room, suddenly turned to face Emma. "How could you let this happen?" he demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you've done to our families?" Before Emma could respond, Robert stood, placing himself between his wife and David. "I understand you're upset, David. We all are. But pointing fingers isn't going to help anyone right now. We need to focus on moving forward, on what's best for our children." Carlos Rodriguez, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Our children," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "But which ones are our children? The ones we raised or the ones we gave birth to?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Sarah, who had been quietly processing the news, finally found her voice. "Why can't we be both?" she asked, her words cutting through the tension. "Why does it have to be one or the other?" All eyes turned to Sarah as she continued, her voice growing stronger. "The Rodriguezes raised me. They loved me, supported me, shaped me into who I am. Nothing can change that. But now I have the chance to know the Thompsons in a new way, to understand a part of myself I never knew existed. Can't that be a good thing?" Michael nodded, picking up Sarah's thread. "Sarah's right. This doesn't have to be about losing family. It could be about gaining more family. Emma felt a surge of pride and love for these two young people who, in the face of earth-shattering news, were showing more wisdom and grace than any of the adults in the room. Dr. Patel, sensing a shift in the room's energy, spoke up again. There are resources available to help families navigate situations like this. Support groups, counseling services. I strongly recommend that all of you take advantage of these as you process this information and decide how to move forward. As the initial shock began to wear off, practical concerns started to surface. Lisa Chun, who had been quiet until now, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What about legalities? Birth certificates? Official documents? Do those need to be changed? Robert, slipping into lawyer mode, addressed the group. Legally, the situation is complex. There's no precedent for a case quite like this. We'll need to consult with family law experts to understand all our options. But I want to echo what Sarah and Michael said. This doesn't have to be about changing the families we have. It can be about expanding our understanding of family. As the discussion continued, Emma found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of the situation. She excused herself, stepping out into the hallway to catch her breath. A moment later, she heard the door open behind her. "Mom?" It was Michael's voice, tentative and unsure. Emma turned, her heart clenching at the sight of the young man she had raised. The young man who, she now knew for certain, was not biologically hers. "Michael, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Michael stepped closer, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "I know, Mom. I'm not angry. At least, I don't think I am. I'm just confused, overwhelmed." Emma nodded, understanding completely. "So am I, sweetheart. So am I." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their new reality settling over them. Finally, Michael spoke again. "You know, when I was little, I used to wonder sometimes why I didn't look more like you or Dad. But then I'd think about how Dad and I both hate olives, or how you and I both cry at sappy movies, and I'd forget all about it." Emma felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Oh, Michael, what I'm trying to say," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger, "is that you're my mom. DNA doesn't change that. It doesn't change the fact that you've been there for every important moment of my life. It doesn't change the love I feel for you and Dad." Emma pulled Michael into a tight embrace, her tears flowing freely now. "I love you so much, Michael. No matter what, you will always be my son." As they held each other in the sterile hospital hallway, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal, emotional, and practical hurdles. But in this moment, she knew that the bonds of love and family were stronger than any DNA test. Back in the conference room, the conversation had taken a more practical turn. The three families were discussing next steps: how to tell extended family members, how to handle public inquiries if the story got out, how to navigate the complex emotions that were sure to arise in the coming weeks and months. Sarah and Elena were deep in conversation, their heads bent close together. Despite the shock of the news, there was an undeniable connection between them, a shared understanding of the complex situation they found themselves in. David Chun-Sar had calmed somewhat, his initial anger giving way to a more nuanced range of emotions. He and his wife were discussing how to break the news to their son, who was away at college and had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. As Emma and Michael re-entered the room, all eyes turned to them. In that moment, Emma realized that this group of people, brought together by chance, mistake, and circumstance, were now inextricably linked. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Robert cleared his throat, addressing the room. "I think we've all had enough shocks for one day. Why don't we take some time to process this information, to talk with our immediate families? We can meet again in a few days to discuss how we want to move forward." There were nods of agreement around the room. As they prepared to leave, Emma noticed Sarah hovering nearby, her expression uncertain. On impulse, Emma opened her arms, and Sarah fell into them, both women clinging to each other as tears flowed freely. "We have so much to talk about," Emma whispered, stroking Sarah's hair. "So much time to make up for." Sarah nodded against Emma's shoulder. "I'd like that," she said softly. As the group filed out of the conference room, there was a sense of unreality to the situation. They had entered as three separate families and were leaving as, what? A complex web of biological and emotional connections. Traditional definitions of family stretched and redefined. In the parking lot, as they prepared to go their separate ways, Michael approached the Rodriguezes. "I know this is weird and complicated," he said, his voice hesitant but sincere. "But I'd really like the chance to get to know you better. If you're open to that." Alina, tears glistening in her eyes, reached out to cup Michael's face in her hands. "Mijo," she said softly, the term of endearment falling naturally from her lips. "We have a lifetime of catching up to do." As Emma watched the interaction, she felt Robert's arms slip around her waist. She leaned into him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert pressed a kiss to her temple. "Now," he said, his voice filled with determination and love, "we redefine what family means." Together, as they drove home, the Thompson car filled with a mix of heavy silence and tentative discussion. Emma found herself thinking about the treehouse that stood between their property and the Rodriguezes. That simple wooden structure had been a bridge between their families for years, a shared space where Michael and Sarah had forged a bond that transcended traditional definitions of siblinghood. Now, Emma realized that treehouse stood as a symbol of the journey ahead. They were entering uncharted territory, navigating a complex landscape of biology, emotion, and family ties. But just like that treehouse, they had the opportunity to build something unique and beautiful, a new kind of family, bound by love, understanding, and shared experience. As they pulled into their driveway, Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversations and challenges that lay ahead. The truth was out, the die was cast. Now came the hard part, figuring out how to move forward, how to honor the past while embracing a future none of them could have imagined. But as she looked at Robert and Michael, her husband and the son of her heart, if not her body, Emma felt a surge of determination. They would find a way through this, together. The days following the revelation at the testing facility passed in a blur of intense emotions and difficult conversations. The Thompson household became a crucible of complex feelings, each family member grappling with the implications of the DNA test results in their own way. Emma found herself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The relief of finally unburdening herself of her long-held secret was overshadowed by the guilt of the pain she had caused. She spent long hours on the phone with her sister, trying to explain the inexplicable, her voice breaking as she recounted the events of the past few days. "I just don't understand, Emma," her sister had said, her voice a mix of confusion and concern. "How could you keep this to yourself for so long?" Emma had no satisfactory answer, only a lifetime of regret and a desperate hope for forgiveness. Robert, ever the pragmatist, threw himself into researching the legal implications of their situation. His home office became a fortress of legal tomes and hastily scribbled notes. Emma would find him there late into the night, his eyes red-rimmed from staring at his computer screen. "There's no precedent for this exact situation," he explained one night over a late dinner. "But there are cases involving switched-at-birth scenarios that might provide some guidance. The key is going to be finding a solution that respects everyone's rights and emotional needs." Michael, for his part, seemed to be on an emotional roller coaster. One moment he would be cracking jokes about having double the holiday dinners now. The next he would fall into a brooding silence, staring at old family photos with a furrowed brow. It was during one of these quieter moments that Emma found him in the attic, surrounded by boxes of childhood memorabilia. "Hey," she said softly, sitting down beside him on the dusty floor. "What are you looking at?" Michael held up a faded drawing, a childish scrawl of stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, and Me. "I remember making this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was for Father's Day when I was 6. I was so proud of it because I'd finally learned how to spell Thompson correctly." Emma felt her heart constrict. "Oh, sweetheart." Michael turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's just, everything I thought I knew about myself feels like it's been turned upside down. But then I look at things like this, and I know that no matter what some DNA test says, you and Dad are my parents. You're the ones who hung this drawing on the fridge, who came to every Little League game, who helped me with my college applications. Single quotes. Emma wrapped her arm around Michael's shoulders, pulling him close. And we always will be, Michael. Biology doesn't change the life we've shared, the love we have for you. As they sat there, surrounded by the tangible remnants of Michael's childhood, Emma felt a renewed sense of determination. They would find a way through this, a way to honor the family they had built while embracing the new connections that had been revealed. Across the street, the Rodriguez family was experiencing their own upheaval. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from work, needing time to process the seismic shift in her understanding of her identity. She spent long hours talking with Elena and Carlos, revisiting old memories and family stories with new eyes. "Do you remember when I broke my arm falling out of the treehouse?" Sarah asked one evening, curled up on the couch between her parents. "Dad, you were so calm, telling me jokes the whole way to the hospital to keep me from crying." Carlos smiled at the memory, though his eyes were sad. "How could I forget? It was the longest drive of my life, seeing you in pain." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's what I mean. DNA o no DNA, you're my dad. You're the one who's been there for every skinned knee, every broken heart, every triumph. That doesn't change because of some test results." Elena, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "But Mihija, what about the Thompsons? They're your biological parents. Don't you want to know them better?" Sarah sat up, facing both her parents. "Of course I do. I have questions, so many questions. But getting to know them doesn't mean losing you. Can't I have both? A family that raised me and a family I'm just getting to know?" As Elena and Carlos exchanged a look over Sarah's head, they realized that their daughter's wisdom surpassed their own in this moment. They had raised her to be strong, compassionate, and open-hearted. Now, faced with an impossible situation, she was drawing on those very qualities to navigate this new reality. Meanwhile, across town, the Chen family was grappling with how to break the news to their son, David Jr., who was away at college. After much discussion and several false starts, they decided that this was news that needed to be delivered in person. Lisa Chun booked a flight, her heart heavy with the weight of the conversation to come. As she packed her bag, she found herself lingering over old photos of David Jr. as a baby, scrutinizing every feature for signs of resemblance to herself or her husband. David saw her, found her like that, tears silently streaming down her face as she clutched a photo album to her chest. "Lisa," he said softly, sitting beside her on the bed, "we don't have to do this. We could just not tell him, keep things as they are." Lisa shook her head, wiping at her tears. "No, we can't do that. He deserves to know the truth. And besides, with the Thompsons and Rodriguez's knowing, it's only a matter of time before it comes out. Better he hears it from us." David nodded, pulling his wife into a tight embrace. "You're right, of course. I'm scared, Lisa. What if this changes how he feels about us? What if he wants to be with his biological family instead?" Lisa pulled back, cupping her husband's face in her hands. "David Chun, listen to me. We have raised that boy for 35 years. We've loved him, supported him, shaped him into the wonderful young man he is today. Biology can't change that. We're his parents, no matter what some DNA test says." As the Chens prepared for the difficult conversation ahead, the three families found themselves drawn together by their shared circumstance. A group text chain was started, initially to coordinate schedules for future meetings, but it quickly evolved into a support system. Messages flew back and forth at all hours. "Just had a meltdown over a baby photo. This normal? Totally normal. Breathe. We're all in this together. Anyone else having trouble sleeping? Mind won't shut off. Try chamomile. And avoid WebEnd at 3 a.m. Trust me, how do we tell the extended family? Dreading the holidays. One day at a time. We'll figure it out together." As the days passed, the initial shock began to give way to a tentative acceptance. The three families agreed to meet again, this time in a more informal setting. Emma suggested a potluck dinner in the Thompsons' backyard, neutral territory that held happy memories for all of them. The evening of the dinner arrived, bringing with it a mix of anticipation and anxiety. Emma busied herself in the kitchen, channeling her nervous energy into cooking. The familiar rituals of chopping, stirring, and seasoning provided a comforting rhythm, a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. As the guests began to arrive, the backyard filled with the awkward energy of people who were once casual acquaintances, now thrust into an intimacy none of them had ever imagined. But as the evening progressed, fueled by good food and a shared understanding of their unique situation, the atmosphere began to relax. Michael and Sarah, ever the bridge between the families, took it upon themselves to break the ice. They regaled the group with stories of their shared childhood adventures, their easy banter a testament to the bond they had formed long before they knew of their biological connection. "Remember when we decided to dig to China in your backyard?" Michael asked, grinning at Sarah. Sarah laughed, the sound lightening the mood. "How could I forget? We got about 3 feet down before we hit a water pipe. Your dad was not happy about that emergency plumber call." "Our dad," Michael corrected gently, glancing at Robert. "He's been a dad to both of us, even if we didn't know it." The simple statement hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the complex web of relationships they were all navigating. Robert, caught off guard by the sudden emotion, cleared his throat before raising his glass. "To family," he said, his voice rough with feeling, in all its wonderful, messy, complicated forms. As glasses clinked and murmurs of agreement rippled through the group, Emma felt a sense of hope blossoming in her chest. This gathering, born out of an impossible situation, was the first step towards a new kind of family, one bound not just by blood or shared history, but by choice, understanding, and love. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be legal hurdles to navigate, emotional landmines to avoid, and a lifetime of adjustments to make. But as Emma looked around at the faces of those gathered, some familiar, some newly significant, she knew that they would find a way forward, together. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Emma found herself standing at the edge of the yard, watching as Michael walked Sarah to her car. The two of them, siblings in heart, long before they knew they were siblings in blood, represented everything that was beautiful and resilient about this new family they were forging. Robert came up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Emma leaned into him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I was just thinking, we have a long road ahead of us." But looking at them, she nodded towards Michael and Sarah. "I think we're going to be okay." Robert pressed a kiss to her temple. "We will be," he agreed. "It won't be easy, but we'll figure it out, one day at a time." As they stood there, watching the last of their guests depart, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The truth was out, the die was cast. Now came the hard part, building a new kind of family, one that honored the past while embracing an unexpected future. But for the first time since her long-ago mistake, Emma felt hope. They would find their way through this maze of biology, emotion, and family ties, together. As the weeks passed, the three families settled into a new rhythm, navigating the complex web of emotions and practical concerns that came with their unique situation. Regular family dinners became a fixture, alternating between the Thompson, Rodriguez, and Chun households. These gatherings, once fraught with tension and uncertainty, gradually evolved into warm, if sometimes awkward, affairs. One such evening found them all gathered in the Rodriguez's cozy living room, the remnants of a hearty paella dinner scattered on the coffee table. The conversation flowed more easily now, punctuated by laughter and the occasional poignant silence as someone grappled with a particularly emotional moment. "So, Carlos Rodriguez began, his voice tentative but warm as he addressed Michael. "Elena tells me you're thinking about going back to school for your MB. Michael nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It still felt surreal to be discussing his future plans with the man who, biologically speaking, was his father. "Yeah, I've been considering it for a while. The company I'm with now offers tuition assistance, so it seems like a good time to make the leap." Elena beamed with pride, her hand unconsciously reaching out to pat Michael's arm. "That's wonderful, mihijo. You've always been so ambitious." The term of endearment slipped out naturally, but it caused a momentary tension in the room. Emma, seated across from them, felt a sharp pang in her chest. She knew Elena meant no harm. They were all still learning to navigate this new family dynamic, but it was a stark reminder of what she had lost, what she had taken from others. Robert, ever attuned to his wife's emotions, squeezed her hand reassuringly. Emma managed a small smile, grateful for his unwavering support. Sarah, sensing the shift in mood, deftly changed the subject. "Hey, did I tell you guys? I finally heard back from that art gallery in the city. They want to feature some of my pieces in their upcoming show." A chorus of congratulations filled the room, the earlier tension dissipating. As Sarah launched into the details of her upcoming exhibition, Emma found herself studying the young woman's face, searching for traces of herself or Robert. It was a habit she'd developed over the past weeks, this constant cataloging of features and mannerisms. Later that evening, as Emma and Robert prepared for bed, she voiced the thought that had been nagging at her all night. "Do you think we're doing the right thing? Trying to blend our families like this?" Robert paused in the act of turning down the covers, considering her question. "I think we're doing the only thing we can do," he said finally. "There's no roadmap for a situation like ours. We're writing the rules as we go along." Emma sighed, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "I know, it's just, sometimes I worry we're asking too much of the kids. Michael and Sarah, they're adults, but this is still such a massive change for them." Robert sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "They're strong, Emma. We raised them to be adaptable, to face challenges head on. And from what I've seen, the Rodriguezes and Chens did the same with their children." Emma leaned into him, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "You're right. I can't help feeling responsible for all of this upheaval." "Emma," Robert said, his voice gentle but firm, "we've been over this. Yes, your mistake set this in motion, but dwelling on guilt isn't going to help anyone. What matters now is how we move forward, how we support each other and our children through this." As they settled into bed, Emma's mind drifted to the Chens. David Jr. had returned to college after a tumultuous week at home processing the news. His parents had reported that he was struggling, but determined to finish out the semester. They'd all agreed to give him space, letting him reach out when he felt ready. Across town, in the Chun household, Lisa lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt emptier than ever with David Jr. back at school. She couldn't shake the memory of his face when they'd broken the news. The shock, the disbelief, the hurt. "Mom, Dad," he'd said, his voice small in a way they hadn't heard since he was a child. "Am I still?" "Me?" The question had broken their hearts. They'd spent hours reassuring him, reminding him of all the ways he was uniquely David Chun Jr., regardless of his genetic makeup. But Lisa knew it would take time for him to fully process this new reality. David saw her, stood beside her, reaching out to take her hand in the darkness. "Can't sleep?" he murmured. Lisa shook her head, then realized he couldn't see her. "No," she whispered, "just thinking about Junior." David S.R. sighed, pulling her close. "He'll be okay," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "He's strong, and he knows we love him, no matter what." As the Chun parents drifted off to sleep, clinging to each other and their faith in their son's resilience, Sarah Rodriguez was wide awake in her childhood bedroom. Her art supplies were scattered around her, canvases in various stages of completion propped against the walls. She'd been painting furiously since the news broke, pouring her tumultuous emotions onto the canvas in swirls of color and abstract forms. Her upcoming gallery show had become a lifeline, a way to process her feelings through her art. A soft knock at her door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, setting down her paintbrush. Elena poked her head in, smiling at the creative chaos of the room. "Mihija, it's late. You should get some rest." Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of the ache in her back from hunching over her work. "I will, Mom. I needed to get this out." Elena crossed the room, careful not to disturb the artwork strewn about. She studied the canvas Sarah had been working on, a complex interplay of warm and cool tones, lines intersecting and diverging in a beautiful chaos. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. Is this about everything that's happened?" Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yeah, I'm calling it Redefining Family. It's about how our lives have all intersected in this unexpected way. How we're all connected now, for better or worse." Elena wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For better, mi amor. Definitely for better." As mother and daughter stood there, contemplating the artwork that sought to make sense of their new reality, Michael Thompson was jogging through the quiet streets of their neighborhood. He'd taken to late-night runs as a way to clear his head, the rhythmic pounding of his feet on the pavement, helping to quiet the constant swirl of thoughts and emotions. He found himself, as he often did, at the old treehouse that straddled the property line between the Thompson and Rodriguez homes. Without conscious thought, he climbed up, settling onto the worn wooden platform. From this vantage point, he could see both houses, the home he'd grown up in and the home of the people who, he now knew, were his biological parents. The dichotomy was still jarring, even weeks after the revelation. A rustling below caught his attention. Moments later, Sarah's head popped up through the trapdoor. "Thought I might find you here," she said, pulling herself up to sit beside him. Michael smiled, unsurprised by her presence. They'd always had an uncanny ability to sense when the other needed company. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "Too much on my mind. You?" "Same," Michael admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the night air cool around them. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah began hesitantly, "what it would have been like if we'd grown up in each other's families, if the mix-up had never happened?" Michael considered the question. "Sometimes," he said slowly. "But then I think about all the experiences that made me who I am, all the moments with Mom and Dad. I wouldn't trade that for anything." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. "I feel the same way. It's weird, isn't it, to be so grateful for a mistake?" Michael chuckled softly. "Our whole situation is weird, Sar. But I think maybe it's okay to be grateful. We didn't just gain biological parents. We gained whole new extended families. That's pretty amazing when you think about it." As they sat there, two siblings bound by both heart and blood, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. It was a new day, full of possibilities and challenges, but they would face it together, all of them. This strange, wonderful, expanded family they were building. Back in the Thompson house, Emma stirred, reaching out instinctively for Robert. Finding his side of the bed empty, she sat up, blinking in the dim light of early morning. She found him in the kitchen, two steaming mugs of coffee on the counter in front of him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, accepting the mug he offered her. Robert shook his head, just thinking. "About family, about the future." Emma nodded, understanding completely. "And what conclusions have you come to, counselor?" Robert smiled, the expression softening the worry lines that had become more pronounced in recent weeks. "That we're incredibly lucky," he said simply. "Despite all the pain and confusion, we've been given an opportunity to expand our family, to love more deeply and broadly than we ever imagined." As they stood there, sharing the quiet of the early morning, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls and challenges. But they would face it together, all of them. This beautiful, complex, expanded family they were forging out of an impossible situation. Outside, the sun crept higher in the sky, painting the world in the soft hues of a new dawn. It was a fitting metaphor, Emma thought, for the new chapter they were all embarking on. A new day, a new beginning, a chance to redefine what family truly means. As the months passed, the three intertwined families continued to navigate their new reality, facing challenges and celebrating small victories along the way. The initial shock had given way to a tentative acceptance, and slowly but surely, they were forging a new kind of family dynamic. It was a crisp autumn day when they all gathered at a local park for a picnic. The occasion? David Chun Jr. was home from college for the weekend, and he had expressed a desire to meet everyone properly this time, without the weight of shock and disbelief clouding the interaction. Emma arrived early, spreading out blankets and setting up the folding tables they brought. Her hand shook slightly as she arranged plates and utensils, her mind racing with all the possible ways this meeting could unfold. Robert placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. Emma nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know. It's just, this feels important, like a turning point." As if on cue, cars began to pull into the parking lot. The Rodriguezes emerged from one, Sarah helping Elena carry an enormous cooler filled with homemade empanadas and fresh fruit. Michael arrived next, his arms laden with bags of chips and drinks. And then, finally, the Chung family arrived. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she saw David Jr. for the first time since the revelation. He looked older somehow, as if the weight of this new knowledge had aged him beyond his years. For a moment, everyone stood frozen, the autumn breeze rustling through the colorful leaves above them. Then, as if by some unspoken signal, they all began to move at once, converging in a flurry of awkward greetings and tentative hugs. David Jr. stood at the center of it all, his eyes wide as he took in the faces of the people who were, in one way or another, his family. Emma approached him cautiously, her heart pounding. "David," she said softly, "I'm Emma Thompson. I'm so glad you could come today." David nodded, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Thank you for organizing this," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I think it's time we all got to know each other." As they settled onto the blankets, passing around dishes and filling plates, the initial tension began to ease. Michael and Sarah, ever the bridges between the families, took charge of the conversation, regaling everyone with stories from their shared childhood. "Remember when we tried to build a zip line from the treehouse to Sarah's bedroom window?" Michael asked, grinning at the memory. Sarah groaned, covering her face with her hands. "Don't remind me. I still have a scar from where I crashed into the rosebush." David Jr. listened intently, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You guys have known each other your whole lives," he said, a hint of wistfulness in his tone. "Hey, that just means we have a lot of catching up to do," Michael replied, his voice warm and inclusive. "I bet you've got some pretty good stories of your own." As David began to share anecdotes from his college experiences, Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was working. Slowly, cautiously, they were becoming a family, unconventional, perhaps, but a family nonetheless. The afternoon wore on, filled with laughter, good food, and the tentative forging of new bonds. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Emma found herself sitting next to Elena Rodriguez. "I never thought we'd be here," Elena said softly, her gaze fixed on Sarah and Michael, who were teaching David Jr. some elaborate handshake they'd invented as kids. Emma nodded, understanding completely. "I know. Some days I still can't believe this is our reality." Elena turned to her, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I wanted to hate you, you know? When we first found out, I thought it would be easier if I could just be angry." Emma's breath caught in her throat. But Elena held up a hand, silencing her. "Let me finish. I wanted to hate you, but I couldn't. Because every time I looked at Sarah, every time I saw the amazing young woman she's become, I knew that in some twisted way, I owed that to you." Emma felt tears welling up in her own eyes. "Elena, you and Carlos raised her. You shaped her into who she is. I just gave birth to her." Elena shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, Emma, you gave us a gift. And now you're giving us another one. The chance to expand our family, to love more deeply than we ever thought possible." As the two women embraced, their tears mingling, Robert and Carlos exchanged a glance. Without a word, they moved to join their wives, enveloping them in a group hug that spoke volumes about the journey they'd all undertaken together. Across the picnic area, David Chinesar watched the scene unfold, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. His wife, Lisa, squeezed his hand reassuringly. "It's okay to feel conflicted," she said softly. "This isn't easy for any of us." David nodded, his gaze shifting to where their son stood, laughing at something Michael had said. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," he admitted. "For Junior to decide he wants to, I don't know, choose them over us." Lisa shook her head firmly. "That's not going to happen, David. Look at him. He's not choosing anyone over anyone else. He's embracing the chance to have more love in his life, more family," as if sensing his parents' gaze. David Jr. looked over at them, flashing a reassuring smile. In that moment, David Sr. felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the fear that had gripped his heart since the day they'd learned the truth. As the day drew to a close and they began to pack up, there was a palpable sense of something having changed. The awkwardness that had marked their earlier interactions had given way to a tentative warmth, a sense of shared purpose. Emma stood back, watching as everyone said their goodbyes. Michael and Sarah were exchanging contact information with David Jr., making plans to meet up for coffee later in the week. The Rodriguezes and Chens were hugging, promising to get together soon for dinner. Robert came up beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Penny, for your thoughts?" he asked softly. Emma leaned into him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I was just thinking, this is what family looks like. It's messy and complicated and nothing like what we expected, but it's beautiful in its own way." Robert nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. "It is, and we're lucky to be a part of it." As they drove home, the car filled with the comfortable silence of a long married couple, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The guilt that had been her constant companion for 35 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had eased, making room for hope, for love, for the possibility of a future brighter than she'd dared to imagine. That night, as she lay in bed, Emma's thoughts drifted to the treehouse that still stood between their property and the Rodriguezes. That simple wooden structure had been a constant throughout this journey, a symbol of the connections that had always existed between their families, even before they knew the truth. She made a mental note to suggest at the next family gathering that they restore the treehouse together. It could be a project that brought them all together, a tangible representation of the new family they were building. As she drifted off to sleep, Emma's last thoughts were of the faces she'd seen at the picnic. Michael and Sarah, Elena and Carlos, David Jr. and his parents. All of them connected now, bound by a twist of fate and the choice to embrace a new definition of family. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges to face, difficult conversations to navigate, and moments of doubt. But as Emma closed her eyes, she felt a sense of hope stronger than any she'd experienced in years. They were writing a new story, all of them together. A story of forgiveness, of love that transcends biology, of family redefined. And though the path was uncertain, Emma knew one thing for sure. They would walk it together, supporting each other every step of the way. As dawn broke on a new day, the first rays of sunlight illuminated the old treehouse, standing strong and steady between the two properties. It was a new beginning for all of them, a chance to build something beautiful out of an impossible situation, a chance to redefine what it truly means to be a family. And as the neighborhood slowly came to life, three households woke to face the day, each carrying with them the warmth and hope of the connections they'd forged. They were no longer just the Thompsons, the Rodriguezes, and the Chens. They were something new, something unique, a family bound not just by blood or circumstance, but by choice, by love, and by the shared journey of rediscovery. The confession that had once threatened to tear them apart had become the foundation for something stronger, something more beautiful than any of them could have imagined. And as they stepped into this new chapter of their lives, they did so not as separate units, but as one united family, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!